Numbers predicting the outcome of this year's corn crop could be a concern for farmers. This week, the USDA's World Agriculture Supply and Demand estimates released its latest report. The report predicts this year will be a record U.S. corn crop. Over 1 billion more bushels than last year are predicted. Retired Iowa State University Farm Extension Specialist Steve Johnson weighs in on if this could push commodity prices even lower.
Acres of this viral kid's absolute favorite food.
What do you like about corn?
It's corn!
There's a reason people call it yellow gold. 2021's corn crop was worth over $86 billion.
According to the USDA, the U.S. is the largest consumer, producer, and exporter of corn in the world.
I mean, look at this chart of U.S. grain crops. And that's because
we're really good at it. And that's why you see big...
The administration continues to carry out its immigration crackdown. American farmers are facing a labor crisis.
But the shutdown also closed the agency that distributes that funding, as Trump is now teasing another kind of bailout.
A potential bumper crop of corn actually has corn growers a little...
They surprised grain traders in mid-January with a friendly crop report. In the January 12th report, the government made a significant downward revision to the size of last year's corn crop and a less substantial downward revision to the size of last year's soybean crop. Corn, soybean, and wheat prices on the CME traded at 5 to 6 year highs following the data and have been in bull market territory for months. The lighter than expected 2020 U.S. crops, paired with strong export demand from China in particular, have helped the...
...and grants to help America's black and other farmers of color. This administration wants to do away with all of those things and help large-scale, white farmers in this country. And what he did was he says, we're going to do away with anything that has to do with black, but we're going to bring white farmers in from South Africa solely based on race. And then we're going to ship out the people who are doing the work here. You know, the Hispanic community that's doing really hard work that many Americans...
Industry. Do you have concerns on this front, and are you hearing about some of these top conservatives saying that there's a push for amnesty for this workforce?
I appreciate you bringing that up. There's been a lot of noise in the last few days and a lot of questions about where the president stands in his vision for farm labor. The first thing I'll say is the president has been unequivocal that there will be no amnesty, and I think that's very, very important. I and the rest of our cabinet certainly support that, effectuate that, and make sure that happens every single day. The second thing, to your question about mass deportations, the president and I have spoken about that once or twice, and he has always been of the mindset that at the end of the day, the promise to America to ensure that we have a 100% American workforce stands, but we must be strategic in how we are implementing the mass deportation so as not to compromise our food supply. Ultimately, the answer on this is automation, also some reform within the current governing structure. And then also when you think about, there are 34 million able-bodied adults in our Medicaid program. There are plenty of workers in America, but we just have to make sure we're not compromising today, especially in the context of everything we're thinking about right now. So no amnesty under any circumstances. Mass deportations.
The first reports came quietly, buried in the middle of routine trade bulletins that farmers barely read during harvest season. A single line that seemed almost out of place. Africa blocks major U.S. corn shipment amid new trade regulations. Most farmers didn't notice. Those who did shrugged it off. Trade disputes happened all the time, usually resolved within days. But this was different, and it would take only 48 hours for the entire agricultural heartland of the United States to realize just how catastrophic the situation was. Africa had blocked not one shipment, not two, but every single U.S. corn vessel en route to its ports. Billions of dollars of grain, months of labor, entire seasons of planning, all suddenly stranded at sea. What confused American farmers most wasn't the action itself. Trade conflicts were part of global economics, but the timing and the reasoning. Africa didn't give a detailed explanation. Instead, a short statement echoed from multiple African trade ministries. Africa will temporarily suspend the import of foreign corn to stabilize local markets and support continental agricultural independence. Temporary, no timeline, no negotiation. And because the vessels were already loaded, insured, and declared for African ports, they weren't allowed to dock anywhere else. They couldn't return. They couldn't redirect. They simply floated under a hot sun in the Atlantic, burning fuel and money. Farmers in the Midwest woke up to flashing alerts on their phones, news anchors stammering, markets crashing in real time. Corn futures plummeted so fast that trading screens couldn't update fast enough. It felt unreal, like some kind of glitch, but it was very real. In farmhouses across the plains, families gathered in living rooms normally reserved for holidays, watching the news with a dread they couldn't quite articulate. Harvest season was already challenging. Fertilizer costs were up, diesel prices unpredictable, irrigation systems aging. But now, something far more destabilizing had arrived. America had lost its largest corn buyer overnight, and it happened without warning. Corn storage across the Midwest was already near capacity. Silos were full. Temporary grain bags lined fields like giant white caterpillars. Some farmers had piles of corn on open ground, covered by tarps that flapped violently in the wind. They had planned their harvest schedule based on the assumption that Africa, now the world's fastest-growing corn importer, would take the shipments as scheduled. But those ships weren't going anywhere, and every hour cost farmers money they didn't have. In Washington, officials scrambled. Phones rang nonstop. Meetings ran around the clock. Trade advisors demanded explanations from African ambassadors, who simply repeated the same message. Africa was prioritizing local farmers. The problem was that Africa had become heavily reliant on American corn over the years, supplying everything from animal feed to industrial processing. Blocking imports wasn't just a trade decision, it was a socioeconomic shift, one that analysts had failed to anticipate. Some suspected political motivations, some blamed global inflation, some believed Africa was asserting new economic independence. But for farmers watching grain markets collapse from the middle of their fields, none of that mattered. What mattered was survival. Across small towns, conversations were tense. Grocery stores, diners, fuel stations, and grain co-ops buzzed with theories and fear. People debated whether the government would intervene. Some wondered if Africa would lift the blockade once diplomatic pressure mounted. Others feared something far more permanent, a shift in global power that left America exposed. In a quiet farmhouse kitchen on the edge of the plains, a radio crackled with updates. The announcer's voice trembled as he broke down the numbers. Billions in losses. Thousands of farmers affected, silos overflowing, rail shipments halted because there was nowhere left to send the grain. And yet the story was bigger than just economics. Africa's decision had sent shockwaves through global supply chains. Countries in Asia began questioning their own import dependencies. Latin American agricultural blocs hinted at similar independent strategies. Even Europe hinted at reviewing its own grain partnerships. For the first time in generations, American farmers faced the possibility that they were no longer the world's agricultural center. What frightened many wasn't the crisis itself, it was the underlying shift that had been building for years. African agricultural technology had advanced rapidly. Drones, automated irrigation, satellite mapping, AI-driven crop rotation, drought-resistant seeds. African nations had been quietly investing in their domestic agriculture with unprecedented ambition. And now, perhaps, they no longer needed American grain. But the question lingered. Why block the shipments so suddenly? Inside the White House, officials debated whether Africa was using the blockade as leverage pressure for better trade terms, a push for agricultural partnerships instead of dependencies, or perhaps something deeper, a continent asserting its economic sovereignty after generations of unequal trade. While Washington tried to interpret Africa's motives, farmers felt the consequences firsthand. Corn prices tanked, loan interest climbed, banks tightened credit, seed orders for the next season dropped dramatically. Merchants, truckers, ethanol plants, and feed mills braced for collapse. Corn wasn't just a crop, it was the backbone of entire regional economies. Without it moving, everything stalled. In Africa, reactions were mixed as well. Some celebrated the decision, calling it a new era of self-reliance. Local farmers saw rising prices and new opportunities. Governments framed it as an economic victory, but others worried about short-term shortages, rising food costs, and whether the continent could scale production fast enough to replace American imports. Analysts across African media outlets described the blockade as a strategic shift, not a retaliation. According to them, Africa had spent years building local capacity irrigation systems in the Sahel, large-scale farms in East Africa, agricultural innovation hubs in southern Africa, and strengthened food reserves in the West. Once the infrastructure matured, the continent was ready to stand independently. The blockade was simply the declaration of a decision long in the making. Back in the United States, the situation worsened as shipping companies began refusing to accept new corn contracts. Insurance firms demanded additional protection clauses. Trade unions protested stalled ports and idling docks. Even railroad unions raised alarms, fearing national job losses. Farmers felt cornered by forces far beyond their control. Among endless meetings and emergency announcements, an emergency agricultural summit was held in Washington. The president's advisors presented a grim assessment. Unless the blockade lifted within weeks, the United States would face its most devastating agricultural recession in modern history. The president demanded options, pressure campaigns, sanctions, trade retaliation. But every aggressive measure risked pushing Africa further away, and the world was watching closely. Many nations viewed Africa's move as a bold stand, not an attack. Diplomats urged negotiation. Trade strategists suggested offering agricultural technology partnerships. Economists proposed debt relief deals. Farmers wanted immediate action, not slow diplomacy. Inside that chaos, a realization settled over Washington like a cold shadow. America depended on Africa as much as Africa had once depended on America. The balance had shifted. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, African agricultural scientists held a press conference explaining the deeper vision behind the blockade. They described Africa's goal of becoming not just food secure, but a global agricultural powerhouse. They cited climate models predicting North American crop instability. They spoke about long-term sustainability and regional self-sufficiency. Their message was clear. Even if harsh, Africa was not punishing America, it was liberating itself. In the American Midwest, however, families didn't feel philosophical. They watched their livelihood collapse through no fault of their own. Some farmers drove long distances just to talk to others, share frustrations, argue, or simply find comfort. Others worked the fields late into the night, even with nowhere to send the grain, anything to avoid thinking about the uncertainty ahead. A sense of helplessness settled like dust after a long summer. The blocked shipments remained at sea, bobbing silently under scorching skies, while investors stared nervously at their screens. Even the captains of the corn vessels were uncertain how long they could wait before fuel or food supplies ran out. Across American media, the story dominated headlines. Analysts argued constantly. Was Africa justified? Should America fight back? Could this spark a global agricultural realignment? In Africa, the ships became a symbol, a turning point, a demonstration that the continent finally had the economic strength to make decisions based on its own interests rather than external pressure. Some African commentators even predicted a new world where African grain fed foreign markets, not the other way around, in the middle of the political storm. A quiet revelation settled in. The blockade wasn't just about corn. It was about power. It was about respect. It was about rewriting a global system that had once treated Africa as a dependent actor instead of a global force. As days turned into weeks, pressure built on both sides of the Atlantic. American farmers pleaded with Washington. African governments faced rising local food demands. Shipping companies began threatening legal action. Exporters warned that if the corn rotted, billions would be lost permanently. It was only when both sides reached the brink of mutual economic damage that negotiations finally became possible. Behind closed doors, diplomats engaged in intense discussions. Africa demanded long-term agricultural partnerships instead of one-sided trade. It pushed for shared research, climate-resilient crop programs, and fairer pricing. It wanted a future where African farmers sold to American markets too. America resisted at first, but with its farmers in crisis and global competitors lining up for African partnerships, it eventually agreed. The blockade was lifted quietly, no dramatic announcement, no celebrations, just a brief note from African trade ministries stating that new terms had been established. When the ships finally docked, the world breathed a sigh of relief, but something irreversible had happened. America realized it was no longer the unquestioned agricultural superpower. Africa realized it held leverage it had never used before, and farmers understood that the world they had known, the world that depended on American corn, was evolving into something far more unpredictable. In the end, the crisis passed, markets stabilized, shipments resumed. But the memory lingered like a shadow, a reminder that global power was shifting, that new alliances were emerging, and that Africa was no longer a background actor in the drama of world economics. Farmers returned to their fields, though with a caution they had never felt before. They planted, harvested, irrigated, and prayed for stability. But deep inside, they knew the truth. What had happened once could happen again. And next time, the world might not go back to normal, because Africa had shown that it could alter the global agricultural system with a single decision, and America, for the first time in generations, had felt the ground shift beneath its feet. The blockade's end brought relief, but not recovery. Even as the stranded vessels finally docked at African ports and unloaded their sun-baked grain, the damage had already seeped deep into the backbone of American agriculture. The weeks of uncertainty had forced grain buyers to reconsider their dependence, pushed banks to rethink farm loans, and left farmers staring at profit sheets drenched in red ink. Corn that had once been destined for African feed mills and food processors now competed in a glutted global market. By the time the ships discharged, corn prices had rebounded slightly, but nowhere near the levels farmers needed to survive. For many, the profits of the entire season had evaporated, swallowed by storage fees, shipping delays, insurance premiums, and collapsing futures. In the agricultural towns of the Midwest, people tried to return to normal routines, but conversations kept circling back to the same questions. Could Africa block shipments again? Would the world continue shifting its supply chains away from American dominance? Could farmers still trust global trade, or was this the beginning of a new era, one where American agriculture no longer dictated the rules? Even the weather seemed to echo the unease. A strange, quiet autumn settled over the farmlands. Harvests finished weeks earlier than usual, not because the work was easier, but because there was less grain to process, fewer shipments to coordinate, fewer trucks on the roads. Grain elevators that were usually overwhelmed this time of year felt eerily calm, as if bracing for storms more dangerous than anything nature could produce. Washington attempted to restore confidence, announcing new export guarantees and long-term agricultural reforms, but farmers had grown skeptical of promises. They wanted stability, not speeches. They wanted predictable buyers, not diplomatic gambles. And as they watched Africa sign new regional agricultural agreements, expanding intra-African trade and strengthening domestic production, it became clear that the world was moving with or without the United States. In Africa, the aftermath of the blockade was transformative. Local farmers who once struggled to compete with cheap imports now enjoyed booming demand. Agricultural cooperatives expanded. Governments invested in irrigation, seed banks, research centers, and grain reserves. The decision to block U.S. corn shipments had been bold, controversial, and risky, but it revealed just how desperately Africa wanted agricultural independence. A new continental movement emerged, advocating for food self-sufficiency and indigenous innovation. Analysts called it the Green Sovereignty Era, a time when Africa would no longer rely on external supplies for its food security. This shift captured global attention, signaling that Africa's economic awakening was real, intentional, and irreversible. For American farmers, this new reality was sobering. It meant competition where there had once been dominance. It meant humility where there had once been certainty. It meant adaptation or disappearance. But amid the fear, a new conversation began. If Africa was redefining its agricultural future, maybe America needed to redefine its own. Farmers gathered in town halls, barn meetings, and cooperative assemblies to discuss new strategies. Some talked about diversifying crops, soybeans, sorghum, specialty grains. Others considered forming direct contracts with Latin American or Asian buyers to bypass traditional export channels. A few even argued for building biorefineries. Locally, to reduce dependence on foreign markets. Slowly, a fragile resilience took hold. In Washington, trade negotiators worked closely with African counterparts to craft a new era of cooperation, one not based on dependency, but on mutual respect. Africa demanded fairer terms, climate-resilient investment, and agricultural technology partnerships. The United States, recognizing that old patterns could no longer be maintained, agreed to reinvent its approach. The new agreement was unlike anything that had existed before. It emphasized shared research, joint climate adaptation programs, cross-continental seed development, and co-investment in agricultural infrastructure. It transformed the relationship from exporter-importer into collaborator-collaborator. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't immediate, but it was a beginning. For farmers, the transition was painful. Many had to restructure loans, sell equipment, or downsize operations. But as the months passed, they recognized a quiet truth. The crisis had exposed weaknesses that had been ignored for too long. Before the blockade, American agriculture had relied on a system built on assumptions of dominance. Now it had no choice but to build a system based on adaptability. The real turning point came when analysts revealed a staggering insight. Africa's blockade had been inspired not by hostility but by necessity. Droughts, population growth, and climate unpredictability had pushed Africa to restructure its food security strategy with urgency. And though the United States had suffered from the shift, Africa's transformation might ultimately lead to stronger global stability when this understanding spread across American farming communities. Something softened. Resentment gave way to pragmatism. Crisis gave way to clarity. The world had changed and America had to change with it. By the next planting season, a cautious optimism returned. Farmers still remembered the fear of watching prices collapse, the helplessness of seeing their grain stranded on the ocean, the bitterness of feeling abandoned by global markets. But they also recognized the resilience that had emerged from the turmoil. They planted again not with blind confidence, but with newfound awareness. They updated irrigation systems, diversified crops, invested in renewable energy, and formed new cooperatives. They fought to reclaim control over their futures. Across the ocean, Africa continued its agricultural transformation, becoming not just a market, but a global producer, innovator, and partner. The world watched as the continent's newfound power reshaped food security, climate strategy, and economic influence. And the United States, humbled yet determined, realized something profound. The global agricultural order was no longer defined by one nation feeding the world. It was a shared system, delicate, interconnected, and shaped by cooperation rather than dominance. In the end, the blockade became a historical turning point, one that forced both continents to redefine their identities, ambitions, and futures. Farmers never forgot the panic of those weeks, but they also never forgot the resilience they discovered within themselves. Trade resumed, but the world was different. Stronger, more balanced, more aware of its interdependence. And as American farmers watched the sun rise over fields ready for a new season, they understood the lasting lesson of the crisis. No nation stands alone, no market lasts forever, and the world moves forward whether anyone is ready or not.